Not again, not again, not again. Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. In this session, we'll be talking to C. Derick Varn and Shalon Tine about the writings of Christopher Lasch. This session was recorded as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-garde Art Practice and Research Group, who meet every 3 weeks to explore ideas related to the history of the avant-garde and radical counterculture. Alongside creating podcasts and events, we also do other pieces of writing, other projects, films, and other creative pieces of work as well, all loosely based in thinking about the avant-garde and the future of the avant-garde. So if you're interested in checking any of that out, please visit our website at www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Soundcloud, YouTube, or Eventbrite. So that's all I've got to say for now. So over to Shalon Tine, C. Derick Varn, and the rest of the crew. Really brilliant to talk to C. Derick Varn and Shalon Tine about their work on Christopher Lasch. So I know that you're working on a book about Christopher Lasch, but you've also been doing some podcasting around Christopher Lasch and sort of working through all of his books. You know, I think it's really exciting. I've really enjoyed listening to the podcast, and I really want to find out more when the book is actually finished. I really look forward to reading it. And I think there's just something really interesting about Lasch's work anyway. I mean, we were talking a minute ago about Christopher Lasch being kind of American. And I suppose for some of us, if you're coming from the UK, then there is a kind of a different context. But I feel like there's something that sort of translates to just cultural politics more generally. I know Shalon's also done some stuff around sort of Adorno. So and I'm quite interested in the way that Shalon sort of links Adorno and Lasch. So I'll probably get to that in a bit. I wish I'd actually been able to read all of Christopher Lasch's works for this session, because I felt like, especially listening to the podcast, that Christopher Lasch's early work seemed quite interesting too. But I haven't actually been able to, and I've mainly sort of focused on the culture of narcissism, which I suppose is the one that people are kind of interested, and there's a sort of interest in. So that's where I sort of started, but I'm really sort of interested in hearing from Shalon and about some of the other work. I'll start with my first question, and then we can sort of take it from there. So you are both collaborating on a book about Christopher Lasch. So how did you first come across his work, and how did this project develop?
I'll start us off on that question, and then I'll turn it over to Shalon. I came across Christopher Lasch as a conservative 20 years ago. For those who don't know my personal and political history, and for those who are confused by how young I look, I'm actually 42 years old. In my early 20s, I was part of a anti-war movement that was very conservative in the United States. And during this time, the only people really talking about Christopher Lasch was a section of paleo-conservatives, some of whom had known him. So one of the more infamous ones is Paul Gottfried, the thesis advisor of a certain Richard Spencer, who wrote a book called The Strange Non-Death of Managerial Liberalism, and who himself was a student of Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School. And he and Lasch actually had exchanged letters. They'd met, and they had similar critiques. Furthermore, a bunch of evangelicals had picked up Lasch after his death, and in fact, one of them is his biographer, for reasons that I don't entirely know, but were pushing him in conservative circles. So I read Culture of Narcissism at a time when it was not particularly being read. It had sort of kind of fallen out of the cultural zeitgeist and was really only being read amongst people who were in a very conservative milieu. What I found interesting about him at that time was that he was until the late 80s, clearly a leftist. And by the late 80s, he still sees himself as coming out of a left-wing train of thought, which he explains in his book in detail, A True and Only Heaven, but had felt like the left had largely abandoned any sense of defense of community life, working class culture, the lower middle class, or the dignity of the poor. He also had a pretty trenchant engagement with feminism. He planted seeds in my mind that, as I kind of realized the problems with this kind of paleo conservatism that I had fallen into, and that had come out of work. And I mean, by work, I mean my actual work, not just intellectual work. I was a teacher, and I had worked in an insurance company, and I started dealing more into the economic issues at hand of the pre-1960s left, and arrived at Karl Marx, right? That's often what happens. Well, so put it on the back burner for about 10 years. In about 2012, 2013, I become involved with Douglas Lane. And I had read a lot more of Lasch by this time. I'd read some of his early books, particularly The Agony of the American Left. And I started really thinking about how he was writing about the history of the US left that the US left had not dealt with. And even today, when American leftists kind of start their history in the late 1950s, they will sometimes skip back and cover the CPUSA, the IWW, and the CPA. I mean, the SPA, which that's the Socialist Party of America, which is defunct in the 60s. The Communist Party USA, which was the Comintern-aligned party in the US that emerged in the late 20s, early 1930s as the dominant form of the US left. And then the IWW, which is the Industrial Workers of the World. The issue, however, is there was tons of gaps in this history that Lasch actually wrote about and fills in. And you start seeing also the fact that in the United States, the labor left and the intellectual community of the left had only seemingly made some kind of alliance in the 1960s, but both had trends going back 100 years that led them there. Now, along comes Trump around 2 years from this. Now, I'm not in America at this point. And everybody's talking about Christopher Lasch again because Steve Bannon brings up the revolt of the elites. And this kind of leftist who became disgruntled with the liberal attitudes of the left became more culturally important all of a sudden. And I started reading people like Angela Nagel, and people around Red Scare who were using Lasch, but they actually had the same reading of him that was based off of the paleo-conservative stuff that I saw in my 20s. And they didn't deal with his entire milieu. And they honestly didn't even really read the books that they canonized, and they love basically three of them: The Revolt of the Elites, Culture of Narcissism, to some degree, True and Only Heaven, and Haven and Heartless World. All right. But they read them as if it was one cohesive thing, and basically reading back from Revolt of the Elites back into all of Lasch's early work. And Shalon and I have been becoming friends around this time, and we started having these long conversations about Christopher Lasch in the way even leftists were actually kind of taking the rightist appropriation of him at face value and trying to use that to come up with a kind of a new left or a post-left or an anti-left socialism, or it gets branded in many different ways. Confusingly, because other things in America have had these names, which is also its own. It's beyond the purview of today. And it became a trend on social media, I started also seeing very decontextualized uses of Christopher Lasch by people who were supposedly Marxist, who were also using very decontextualized and selective and frankly bad readings of Marx. So in talking to Shalon about this, I just, I said, look, like, I don't think everything Christopher Lasch says is right. I don't think all of it stands the test of time, but I don't think we should cede this to right-wingers and to leftists who basically also either attack Lasch as if he's a right-winger or try to make the right-wing reading of Lasch somehow copacetic with some new form of Marxism. And then Shalon started talking to me about her perspective, and I'll let her represent that now.
Yeah, so sort of jumping off of what Derick said, we both noticed, around the Trump era, sort of resurgence of Lasch, but we were both disappointed by the fact that this new conversation about Lasch seemed to be very superficial, people not really reading his works, misinterpreting his works. So that led us to deciding to collaborate on a project about Lasch where we try to give his ideas justice. Also, I've been in a PhD program now for now too long, and my doctoral advisor, Kevin Mattson, was Lasch's student. So Lasch was his advisor in grad school, and after Lasch died, Dr. Mattson took over teaching some of Lasch's classes and kind of helping to clarify some of his ideas. So having worked closely with my advisor was sort of a second degree to Lasch, because he knew him personally. He was able to give me some insight onto his personal life and worldview in a way that I couldn't really get from the mainstream conversation. Also, I was doing a lot of research. How I really stumbled across Lasch myself was I was doing a lot of research on the 1970s in the United States, and works like Culture of Narcissism kept coming up alongside similar works that came out in the 70s, such as Tom Wolfe's Me Decade, which was a famous essay around that time. There was a book by Jim Hugin called Decadence that was talking about narcissism. So there was all kinds of works before Lasch wrote Culture of Narcissism that dealt with this notion of a shifting culture towards narcissism. And when Lasch wrote Culture of Narcissism, it's in part in response to some of these other intellectuals and academics who are writing on this topic. So one of the things, though, that I noticed was that Lasch's approach was different than some of these others, and that he makes explicitly clear when you read Culture of Narcissism. Whereas people like Tom Wolfe and some of these other figures who are writing about these changes happening in the 1970s, they tended to write about these changes in very sort of moralistic terms, like a decay of culture or a rise of selfishness. But Lasch is very clear that he is approaching it from a more economic angle. He's looking at how capitalism is part of the problem, and that the contemporary climate in the 1970s was shifting towards a therapeutic climate, one where you see the rise of a lot of self-help books and preoccupation with new age alternative religions and things that are all focused on self-fulfillment, self-enlightenment, this focus on the self. And so, but Lasch, he he's going to say that, and we'll talk more about this further on, but one of the things that distinguished him is that he is looking at this not from a religious or moral standpoint like some of his contemporaries, but instead he's looking at it from the problem of capitalism and how this new shift towards therapy culture is really a survival mechanism because so many of these institutions had decayed, and so people were experiencing that at a deep level and large scale. So that's really kind of how I came around to Lasch. And then like how what Derick said, we noticed in the last few years, there's been a resurgence of Lasch. But we were both disappointed in how that larger conversation was taking place. And both the left and the right seem to be misreading him or reading him very superficially in order to sort of use his ideas for their own ideological purposes. So we wanted to delve into his works more thoroughly and really delve into what he's really saying and how he's relevant for today.
So yeah, one of the things I found really useful about your podcasts on Lasch was the way that you sort of contextualized his work by working through his entire oeuvre. This seemed to be a response to a tendency to misread Lasch, his work on both the left and the right, which you sort of already talked about. In order to counter this, you've been sort of reading through his works and interviewing his former students. Could you tell us a little bit about the problems of Lasch scholarship and how this is influencing your approach?
Yeah, and I can jump in here on this. So, I mean, some of what I'll say here applies beyond Lasch and just academic scholarship generally. But regardless of the subject matter, in order to properly write history, it's really important to understand people and their ideas in context to their time and place. So now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that one's time and place fully explains their ideas, which I actually find that is a common mistake people make. But you'll often see writers get so wrapped up in the history that they lose sight of some of the thinker's key insights. But understanding the context for how a thinker's ideas developed can really clarify our interpretations and help to explain parts of their thought which may not make sense upon first glance. So if you're giving a superficial reading to somebody, then their words can easily be misinterpreted. So it's really important to understand when writing history, especially intellectual history, the history of ideas, that ideas don't happen in isolation. They're part of a larger social and political and economic and cultural matrix that influence that thinker's worldview. And there's another thing to consider here, and again, this is generally beyond Lasch, but most people's thinking is not static, but it changes over time. So, in fact, we should probably raise an eyebrow if someone's thought didn't develop over the course of their life. So this is why it's really important for figures like these to really read them in chronological order, to see how their ideas have evolved over time, how they've responded to new historical phenomena that they encounter. I often see interpretations of a theorist or a philosopher's ideas misconstrued because the writer might cherry pick their ideas or jump around in that person's thought, taking those ideas out of context. So that can lead to a really kind of fragmented, for lack of a better word, kind of a fragmented perspective on their philosophies. Now, personally, my background's in both philosophy and history, but I do read a lot, and my approach to writing is very systematic. So, in order to understand Lasch's works, I really knew that I had to read him, from his early works onward up through the end of his life. And we had to read him in chronological order to see how his ideas evolved over time. But another important aspect of that is, and important for this project, is that we have to read the contemporaries, that his contemporaries, and the discourse that he's involved in, because Lasch was a voracious reader, and much of his works are heavily footnoted. You'll see that there are very large bibliographies, and he's in engagement with all kinds of the humanities and social sciences. So not only is it important to read through his own chronology of works, but also to read the people he's reading and the people he's talking to really see how his ideas have evolved. Thinking about culture narcissism, for example, this was, like I mentioned earlier, one of the later works on this concept of narcissism on a societal scale. And it came in response to kind of a larger body of work on the topic that arose in 1970s. So one of the problems for the average person in understanding someone like Lasch is that they also need to know these kinds of arguments that Lasch is in dialogue with, and they also need to know some of the major changes happening in American society during the 1970s. And people do have sort of a short memory, so some of this stuff does get lost just naturally over time. Now, one of the problems here too is the sheer body of work that one must read to get a clear picture of Lasch's ideas, and hopefully Derick and I can accomplish that. But another issue with this scholarship is that, like I mentioned earlier, most people read very superficially, and this isn't just a problem of the general public. I see a lot of academics who also read very superficially, so that's a big problem. And
Can
this
I
is
interject here
especially,
for a second?
yeah.
I would actually say that academic training in itself often encourages superficial readings. My example of this is when you enter a PhD program, you're giving 400 books to read in 2 years. Like there's no meaningful way to read those books closely enough to actually have significant opinions on all of them. But you do have to come up with a coherent narrative, either in an oral or written defense, usually. Now, this training seems like it would lead to a depth of knowledge, and it gives you the basic insight on what's going on in your field. And so this is not to say that it's just methodologically bad. I'm not even arguing that, but the breadth of what it takes to master a subject area increasingly becomes, particularly in the humanities, where this kind of massive reading lists are promoted, training people to read quickly and superficially, and with their own responses already made in mind. And I mean, Lasch is complaining about this during his lifetime, and it's something that he talks about. But I mean, I see this a lot when I read PhD academics, specialists in the field, and I, who am not a PhD academic, can often, but knows what they're talking about, can often tear their arguments apart because they're engaging with the material at such a basic level because they read so much so quickly.
I was just going to add to that, which is that not only does this sort of reading kind of end up being almost like people regurgitate platitudes that their teachers taught them, and sort of there's these kind of bullet points. It leads to this kind of bullet point understanding of arguments, and that's really a big problem, especially in some cases it's not as bad of a problem if you're reading something that's just sort of matter of fact, giving you some basic history. But it is a big problem when you get to figures like Lasch, or figures like him who are, developed elaborate arguments and philosophies and ideas that are complicated. They can't be easily explained in a couple sentences. So, and I'll also add too that social media is something that makes this much worse. You know, what's often the case today with philosophers or theorists who don't really fit into well-defined boxes. You'll sometimes see usually you'll see like an academic of some kind who will write a book or an essay on a particular figure. And then that particular secondary interpretation gets circulated among certain social media circles. And then those ideas get watered down and get caught up in the algorithms. And people end up developing this kind of meme level, really cursory opinions of the figure in question. So now, of course, nobody can read everything about a thinker. That's not doable. But it is concerning when people who aren't engaging at any meaningful level with a thinker still end up developing strong opinions about them, and that's a problem. And that's, of course, enhanced in a negative way by social media. I mean, I've seen online people arguing to the death over an author's interpretation of a thinker that they haven't actually read, let alone actually engaging with with the original thinker's ideas. And you know, to be clear, this isn't just a problem with the left, it's across the board. This is a contemporary problem. But I think those of us on the left, we can't afford to be this kind of lazy in our thinking. And, you know, so it's a wide scale problem, but especially so with people like Lasch and, you know, because Lasch did not fit neatly into these political boxes that we're comfortable with. In fact, you know, I would even argue that some of our most interesting figures never do. It's kind of a weird form of anti-intellectualism that, you know, to assume that we can't learn from figures who don't see the world exactly the way we do. And I'll just say one last point, you know, before moving on, that makes it difficult with studying Lasch, is that people often make the is-ought error when it comes to complex thinkers. They often conflate the critiques a thinker is making about the way things are and mistakenly think that the author is trying to say that that's the way things should be. Throughout Lasch's work, he points to a long history with the problems of liberalism and its various offshoots, but both conservatives and liberals have often taken this as meaning that he's advocating conservatism as an alternative. But that would be a mistake to interpret him that way, especially in America, where liberalism and mainstream conservatism aren't really as dissimilar as they like to think that they are. So Lasch looks at the radical elements of populism that have often been ignored by liberals, who are more obsessed with the flaws of populism than the actual aspects of it that align with socialism of the same time period. And because he, you know, criticized that liberal version of progress, Lasch was often accused of being nostalgic for the past. But Lasch explicitly denied this. And even if you look in True and Only Heaven, one of his later works, he spends an entire chapter explaining the difference between nostalgia for the past versus historical memory. And for Lasch, history and memory is really important because it helps inform the present. But that doesn't mean he's advocating returning to some kind of previous traditions. So, you know, those are some of the difficulties in studying any figure that doesn't really fit into these clear categories. But it's especially the case with people like Lasch.
Yeah, so in your discussion of Lasch's work, you've divided it into 3 periods. Could you tell us a little bit about these periods and how Lasch's thought develops throughout his lifetime?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. The 3-period thing, and I may even add a 4th period now, and I'll go into that at the end, is due to looking at how these books were both received at the time, who's their audience were aimed for, and then what were the underlying conditions that he was writing about. So the first period, which I would call like showing the left to itself, particularly the US left, is the American liberals in the Russian Revolution, New Radicalism in America, 1889 to 1963, The Agony of the American Left, and The World of Nations. And these all are books of essays that are arranged in chronological order. So the essays tell aspects of a history of the development of left and liberal thought in the United States, as separate from left and liberal thought in Europe. And he also contextualizes the social groups and classes. And I use that term differently than Lasch, because I kind of have a strict Marxist definition of class most of the time. So sometimes we're talking about social groups that if you were to call them classes would be confusing when talking about a Marxian class analysis. What the context of those emergences were, and then how they currently inform the emergence of the New Left in the 1960s, and then where that goes. Now, then we have what I kind of see as the crisis period, and that's Haven in a Heartless World, Culture of Narcissism, and the Minimal Self. All right. And they all have crisis names. Haven in a Heartless World, The Family Besieged, Culture of Narcissism, American Life in the Age of Diminishing Expectations, The Minimal Self, Psychic Survival in Troubled Times. And it is significant that these are written in the late 70s to the early 1980s. So he's responding to the end of the New Left, but also the end of the Fordist social democratic Keynesian consensus, all right, that has seemingly burnt out, and the cultural developments from that. And then we have what I like to call the period of despair, which is The True and Only Heaven, Progress and Its Critics, 1991, and The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy, 1994. And this is where most conservatives draw their vision of Lasch. This is where most actually modern American post-left Marxists draw their vision of Lasch. And he has given up at this time period on the left. He sees the Marxist left as having not been able to address the problems of either the United States or of Europe, and particularly in the USSR itself. He sees progressive concessions to different periodizations of capitalism as defining US life, and he sees the emergence of a bunch of different social classes that he calls kind of an overclass as becoming the dominant speaker of progress itself. Right? Now, the reason why I say that you might want to add a fourth period and why this is complicated is there's also the fact that Revolt of the Elites and Woman in the Common Life are assembled from notes and outlines that he made and essays that he wrote, but by his daughter, Elizabeth Quinn Lasch, who does not really share his politics, who is a more conservative figure. I would not say she's like an outright conservative figure, but she is a more conservative figure. If you read her own works, that is where she tended to lean. And she tended also to cooperate with, for example, Lasch's biographer, who is an evangelical Christian, etc., at the expense of actually some of the more leftist parts of his thought. And so it becomes very hard to disentangle in this last period, this posthumous period, if this is what Lasch really thought in a completed, thought out way, had revised his own thought, or if this is somewhat directed by his daughter. That is not a question that we actually can settle. That is a philological question that is very difficult to answer even today, because we don't have his notes. So that's why there's three periods. There are kind of shifts in each one of these. So for example, Haven in a Heartless World does not do the Freudian post-Frankfurt School Freudianism that you will see in Culture of Narcissism and the Minimal Self. And it's also important to note that the kind of Freudianism that Lasch is using in this period is not even exactly like Frankfurt School Freudianism or Lacanian Freudianism or any of the European kinds. He's really drawing from Norman O. Brown and like terror management theory and kind of social Freudianism that was popular in the 60s and 70s in America, but has kind of not been maintained or kept up by most of the left, who kind of went to more European models of psychoanalysis in the 80s and 90s, for reasons that I think are complicated. So that makes that, it ironically makes the period of Lasch at its highest popularity kind of the most difficult to interpret, because he's using a set of analytical tools that we don't really use that way anymore, and both frustrates clinicians who use like kind of clinical Freudian analysis, maybe of like the English school, or like a Wilfred Bryan or something like that. And also people who use this in the more popular moralistic way, like Tom Wolfe. It just doesn't really fit. Which is why Minimal Self is written, partly to explain what Culture of Narcissism actually was about. And the True and Only Heaven, which I think is a very important book because it's the only place I've found where Lasch actually gives a narrative of his own intellectual development autobiographically. And it's in the first chapter of that book, where he goes through why he developed the thought that he did, who he pulls from. And a lot of people don't really even pay attention to who he's pulling from. So yeah, in that book, he's writing about Emerson and Martin Luther King and agrarian populist. But he's also saying that he's pulling from people like E.P. Thompson and the English Marxist school. He pulls a lot from Raymond Williams. He is in dialogue with the Frankfurt School, but really kind of only endorses Marcuse kind of directly. He's ambivalent about Horkheimer and Adorno because he feels like they have abandoned any notion of the validity of working class culture or the working class itself. And he has completely disengaged with like a lot of, for example, there's a famous exchange in Cocoon magazine in 1987 that annoys Shalon that I rely so much on this essay. But that he's engaging with Lichtenstein and some Trotskyists who just throw out bad consciousness for why the workers in America don't do what they want them to do, why they're not politically engaged, why they're either voting conservatively or not voting at all. And that's important. I think it's weird to read him in the obsessions of today. I was reading this morning, I was reading contemporary criticisms of Lasch by feminists, and I came across this blog post by Robin Mary Everbeck, who like was talking about he was, just basically accusing him just a white man who didn't understand Black struggles. And off the book she's writing about, that might be fair, but if you go back and read his early work, for example, he spends chapter after chapter talking about the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, Black nationalism in America, its relationship to the communist movement. And he actually, for example, talks about both the problems with fetishizing the Black American experience as somehow totally unique, but also that it is a separate subject and absolutely needs to be factored into of its own history and not just projected upon by white people into any understanding of the US left. And hearing someone say he just didn't care about that, you can't have read his work, his particularly early work, and think he didn't know about it or was just rejecting it. So these are the kinds of things that this periodization makes clear. But there is a relationship between each period. Like there are breaks, and particularly in what we call the period of despair. But there's also continuities that you can find going all the way back to his first and second book. And I'm going to let Shalon talk a little bit about this now.
Yeah, I mean, I do see a continuity in Lasch's works from his early work through the end of his life. And I think if you want to look at it as a long evolution, one way to think about it is he tried to delve into these topics in depth early on, and then throughout his career kept trying to re-explain things that he felt people were misunderstanding. And so you can kind of look at his entire catalog of works as him explaining and re-explaining and trying to reword and in a sense dumb down his ideas more and more over time to where they have more appeal to the general public. One thing to keep in mind is that Lasch was one of the first big public historians in the US at a time when that was a thing that was kind of developing along both the left and the right. And so he was very he was one of those figures who did not think that history was something that should be relegated to the ivory tower. He felt that history was important for the public, and he spoke a lot about the importance of public life as well, and understanding our history. So, I mean, for one example, like culture of narcissism was so widely misunderstood that it's almost as if he wrote Minimal Self, the book that comes directly after, as a way of explaining culture of narcissism. So it's can't think off the top of my head of very many figures who have written a book to explain a previous book that they wrote. But he's also directly addressing attacks from both feminists and conservatives who he felt misread in. So in my opinion, I've always felt that Lasch was a very clear writer, and that's one of his strong points. But regardless of that, he did have a hard time throughout his whole life getting his ideas across to the public. And, one area where Derick and I, might disagree, and it's the kind of thing that we're constantly sort of fleshing out, but is in sort of his later works and his later life. I view him in his later life as sort of throwing up his hands, feeling frustrated and exhausted at having spent his whole life trying to elaborate on ideas that were constantly misconstrued, and dealing with the fact that, frankly, the American left seemed pretty feeble and impotent. And, he expands on this idea. There's a interview that he did in 1993, about a year before he died, where he states that he sees himself he still sees himself coming from that socialist tradition, but these categories of left and right at the end of the 20th century didn't seem to make much sense anymore. And, anytime that, he began to look at this, how this notion of progress was so ingrained in the American mindset. It had really essentially infiltrated mainstream politics so much that any critiques of progress, or the notion of believing in this sort of liberal idea of progress, any critiques about that were sort of leveled against him as him being nostalgic, which he explicitly says that he's not. So I read his later works as kind of more of a last gasp of trying to dumb down his ideas, coupled with this sense of hopelessness about the state of the left, which, to be fair, is an understandable feeling. In my view, if somebody was, alive and living in the US in the 80s and 90s, there was not really much of a left to talk about. I mean, we've seen a sort of resurgence in recent years in interest in ideas like socialism and whatnot. But at the end of the Cold War, it was pretty commonplace mindset that liberalism had won, and there were plenty, both intellectuals and regular people who thought that. And I'll also just add a little bit of biographical context here, which is that towards the end of his life, when he was writing his later works, Lasch was dying of cancer, and it played a major toll on his ability to write and think, which is why his daughter was the one who really finished off Revolt of the Elites and got it published. So, you know, we can't discount the fact that there is some outside ideological influence beyond his control in his last book, which is why I personally don't find that particular work reliable in explaining his overall thought. I think we can look towards his other works to give a clearer picture.
Yeah. I also definitely prioritized works written before he had cancer and published during his lifetime with his own approval over works that are unfinished, were assembled by his daughter, or because while his daughter put together and with his blessing, so we should not, you know, there's nothing nefarious here about that, but we don't know how much of Lasch she is guiding, and we do know, and we know this from his students, that he was having trouble finishing this work because the cancer and the treatment for the cancer was taking a toll on him. And so, you know, I don't want to totally biographize a man as pretending that the biography leads to necessarily any particular turn of their thought, but there is a very real sense in which his late work is limited by that. I also think we have to deal with the fact that many people who interpret him now, like his late writings about populism versus his early writings about populism, his flirtations and rejection of communitarianism, have to do with him trying to deal with the fact that most of the left he had either seen as becoming dialectical in the fact, using dialectics to hide the fact that they had the same liberal Whiggish view of history that liberals did, or that they literally thought things like, you hear this all the time, the moral arc of history, you know, is in the favor of blah, or we're on the right side of history. These phrases betray the fact that a lot of the left in the English-speaking world, and here I'm going to actually generalize beyond America, has viewed itself as the morally most developed part of the country, the economically most developed part of the world. And one of the things that Lasch continually points out that people miss about him when they just accuse him of being like another white dude who's a concern troll, which I've literally read modern historians accuse him of, is that he's pointing out how much this progress is even dependent on in True and Only Heaven, he says it verbatim, that it's dependent on workers in the developing world being subjugated and even internal minorities being subjugated. All right. So this is not a person who doesn't see that. And in fact, I think he one of his frustrations is, for all the talk of anti-imperialism and this and that on the left, that none of their policies reflect that at all. And so the hypocrisy leads him into a cul-de-sac that he can't really get out of. His attempts to find other traditions that were concurrent with the left, such as communitarianism. He was particularly in dialogue with people like Michael Sandel, and Amitai at Zioni, but he doesn't actually go there. He can't actually embrace them fully either. And even populism, he finds, which is the closest thing he finds to defensible, he has major caveats about, even in his late life. In his early life, he writes extensively on the problems of leftists trying to adopt it uncritically. In fact, he attacks Michael Harrington in the 60s and the 70s for doing this, a name that has come back up. And so, yeah, I definitely think that's why we want to contextualize him and put it in this context and have these periods. I also think, and I think Shalon will echo this, getting mad at someone for not having the solution to obvious problems does not make the problems that they point out irrelevant. And this is particularly true on the family, because Lasch, Shalon and I have gone back and forth about our feelings about this, but Lasch's Lasch's critique that progressive leftism has nothing really to say about the family other than to substitute for its declining functions, bureaucratic functionaries. People have said, well, in the age of neoliberalism, that's not happening. And I'm like, really, it isn't? We're not opening charter schools and creating public-private markets that are still bureaucracies. They're just now not even completely privatized bureaucracies so people can make more money off of it. No, I don't think you're actually reading what he's saying. And that's a big issue here. Does he, and I guess to put it into context for right now, he was talking about how all the social progress that they had, that the progressives had instituted, had become through a fiat of court orders and bureaucratic and executive orders, right? That didn't solidify them that strongly in society, even when they're popular, which they aren't when Lasch is writing, but they are now. But in a way that they could be undone with the stroke of a pen, which we've literally now seen, right? So some of his things, I feel like a lot of people are dealing with it by saying, well, no, like, I don't want to look at that, as some of the consequences of what he was talking about become readily apparent to everybody. Anyway, rant over.
So in the culture of narcissism, Lasch tells us that notwithstanding his occasional illusions of omnipotence, the narcissist depends on others for self-esteem. He cannot live without an admiring audience. His apparent freedom from family ties and institutional constraints does not free him to stand alone or glory in his individuality. On the contrary, it contributes to his insecurity, which he can overcome only by seeing his grandiose self reflected in the attention of others, or by attaching himself to those who radiate celebrity, power, and charisma. For the narcissist, the world is a mirror, whereas the rugged individualist saw it as an empty wilderness to be shaped in his own design. So I think this is quite a useful quote to sort of start thinking about what Lasch means by narcissism. Yet Lasch also writes in The Minimal Self that narcissism is a difficult idea that looks easy, a recipe for confusion. How should we think about Lasch's usage of the concept of narcissism, and what are the difficulties involved in its usage?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit on this. So the first thing I'll note is that narcissism is often confused with this concept of selfishness. But that's not what narcissism means in a psychoanalytical sense. So in psychoanalysis, narcissism is a personality type where a person cannot distinguish between their self and the external world. So there's a natural, healthy form of narcissism that we all experience as children, of course, where we've not yet developed an individual self beyond our mother. We are attached. But in Freudian terms, there's a secondary form of narcissism where, and I'm just going to really put this in simple terms here, but the individual self is essentially emptied out. So a person needs constant external validation to kind of fill a void that's no longer fulfilled by the mother, or in this case, in Lasch's case, by the family. So there's a kind of irony here where, unlike the typical assertion that a narcissist is just somebody who's arrogant or selfish, how we use the term narcissism in a colloquial sense, this is not really what he means in a psychoanalytical sense. It's more like the person is an empty shell in a survival mode. So Lasch takes this concept of narcissism and applies it in a broader socioeconomic context. Now, when we look at America in the 1970s, and the 1970s around industrialized nations or many of them were experiencing this, but particularly in America, we're looking at the United States is in a period of economic decline, and for all sorts of various reasons. There's a really strong increase in political polarization. It's a period where you see a rapid decline in public trust in institutions. This dwindled, and I mean, this is a chartable decline. And the kind of communal radicalism, or at least the perception of a communal radicalism of the 1960s, it seemed to have lost a lot of its steam. In its place, what we see then in the 1970s is the rise of all kinds of self-help methods and treatments and new age practices that focused on the self, not community, but self-improvement, self-enlightenment, that kind of thing. So in the 1960s, you have, you had these like new left activists, people like Jack Weinberg, for instance, who, once had declared that, oh, we should never trust anyone over 30. It was kind of one of those aphorisms of the 60s. But now in the 1970s, you have these same figures, like, for example, Jerry Rubin wrote a book called Growing Up at 37, where he's, sort of rejecting his, his activism of the 60s and talking about engaging in all these new age and self-help practices and treatments and things, and this constant search for self-fulfillment. So we see this abandonment of what was, at least on a small scale, a radical politics that was sort of revived in the 1960s. Many of those people abandoned that by the 1970s. And then, of course, mainstream culture also adopted this kind of shift towards self-help kinds of things. And this turn, what Lasch is going to say is essentially a turn towards what we now call therapy culture. And one thing that, indicates a kind of social shift best explained through this concept of narcissism that Lasch talks about. Now, to be clear, and like I said earlier, Lasch is not the only person talking about narcissism at this time. This was an idea, this was an entire discourse happening during the 1970s. But one of the things that makes him different is that, unlike people like Tom Wolfe, who, in Tom Wolfe's view of narcissism, he sort of accused people of just becoming more selfish. And, Hugin's book on decadence really spoke in terms of like cultural decay. Lasch is not talking in those moralistic kinds of terms. Lasch made it clear he was not speaking about moral decline, but rather he was tracing these contemporary trends, and contemporary, I mean in the 1970s, he was tracing these trends back to the 19th century with the rise of bourgeois social reformers. So, these progressives who used social reform as a kind of therapy, and whose views aligned really well with the growing capitalism in the United States at the turn of the century. So by the time you get to the late 20th century, this kind of history had morphed into the kind of therapy culture that we see in full force today, where raising children is essentially done by experts in the university system and the state, where every problem is handled by these supposed experts, prescription drugs, particularly therapy. And, Lasch is not saying, of course, just to be clear, Lasch is not saying if you need therapy that you shouldn't get therapy. That's not what he's talking about. He's pointing to a larger problem of capitalism, that this therapy culture shifts our focus away from dealing with the problems of capitalism, the problems that instead of having to actually address these problems of capitalism, this large-scale therapy culture has just tried to make it easier for us to personally individually deal with these problems of capitalism. So it's almost as if this widespread therapy culture has become a kind of balm or like a salve, that's just kind of helping us feel better instead of having us face the actual problems of capitalism that are making us feel like we have to go into survival mode on mass scale. So Lasch is really elaborating on a bigger problem in American society, where all these social and economic institutions have really failed us and left us empty and searching for anything to kind of help us, these sort of self-help style solutions just to survive. So that's really what Lasch is talking about when he's talking about this concept of narcissism.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on that too. One of the things that I see as development of that, and one of the reasons why I've always found Lasch useful, is that the therapeutic culture elements, which is to get you more functional, happier within a capitalist context, no matter, and to be amenable to, quote, progress, unquote, and regardless of what that progress is, deeply infected politics and the time period that he's writing. This is when we get the time period of the personal as political. Now, I have done a history around the use of that phrase. The personal as political in the 50s and 60s context meant by feminists and feminist socialists that protecting people who had abhorrent relations with their partners and stuff in a political context, regardless of what they did politically, was still hurting women as a cultural norm. That's where that phrase comes from. But by the time you get into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it starts to be conflated with personal rebellion as the primary expression of your politics. Think about hippies, think about selling out in the 80s and 90s, think about all these terms. But the other thing that happens, all right, is politics start taking an explicitly psychological metaphor and literalizing it. All right. And you see this in the discussion of microaggressions, which is unconscious statements of aggressive tendencies towards other people, and that being a primary focus of political exchange. Now, politically, what's the answer to microaggressions? Nothing. There is no political answer to microaggressions, right? The answer is to change yourself. All right. Similarly, this idea that the personal is political starts getting manifested in the policing and social monitoring of political expressions of opinion and behavior, but not doing anything to change the underlying conditions which prompt them, right? Which is another thing that Lasch increasingly focuses on there in the 80s and 90s. It becomes just the march of progress will fix this for us. Until then, we need to make our politics about civilly regulating our various disagreements, our symbiotic this or that, changing the way we speak, accommodating the way we speak, because that shows the way we feel inside. But you will see that the more you think about this therapeutic approach to politics conflates the personal and systemic entirely. And it makes it actually where the systemic is never addressable, except through the intervention of experts who people resent. All right. And it also leads to all kinds of other incoherences. For an example I always talk about is trauma and trigger warnings. All right. I don't have a problem with trigger warnings as an act of informed consent in regards to what is essentially a cultural transaction, fine. But notice I have to phrase that all in capitalist terms, right? But let's also think about the fact that that's not how triggers in trauma work, and yet we still have to rely on what is effectively a psychological metaphor from therapy, right? That gets picked up in specific disability communities that use it in a very particular way, and then gets expanded out as a political category, and a way to regulate the interaction of different bureaucratic factions. And of course, people pick it up because Lasch's point is they rightly resent bureaucracy. ironically, this resentment of bureaucracy in both left and right increases its need. So you can see this on the left, obviously, but let's talk about it on the right. On the right now, you have things like, the fear of culture, of CRT and cultural things in America, and it may be finally any general idiocy that happens in America will trickle to the rest of the English-speaking world eventually. So it's probably happening in England now too. The way that they handle that is by actually increasing oversight and administration and expanding bureaucratic nodes to deal with it. So, look at DeSantis. He appoints more people in the secretary in his education department to spend more time going over the ideological content of math questions. That's not going to be something that that's going to reduce bureaucracy. It's actually going to increase it. So you see this throughout the political spectrum. So the therapeutic here is not just a critique of the left, it's a critique of capitalist culture as a whole, of which the left is a part and has to be a part, because there really isn't anything outside of it, which is part of what Lasch's frustrating, and particularly later in life, hopelessness seems to come from.
Like Guy Debord's critique of the society of the spectacle, Foucault's kind of interest in the panopticon, and Adorno's kind of critique of the culture industry, Lasch seems to be sort of deploying a kind of Marxist critique of consumer capitalism and mass media. In making allusions to the society of the spectacle, Lasch writes that cameras and recording devices not only transcribe experience, but alter its quality, giving to much of modern life the character of an enormous echo chamber, hall of mirrors. Life presents itself as a succession of images or electronic signals, of impressions recorded and produced by the means of photography, motion pictures, television, and sophisticated recording devices. The intrusion into everyday life of this all-seeing eye no longer takes us by surprise or catches us with our defenses down. We no longer need reminder to smile. How is Lasch's critique of consumerism and mass society similar and different from that of Debord, Foucault, and Adorno?
Well, I have some things I can say on this question. I'd first like to just make a small clarification that, sometimes consumerism and capitalism are conflated, and of course they are overlapping but distinct ideas. So, critiquing consumerism sometimes has a more liberal moral quality to it that places the blame of economic problems on the consumer, and usually in terms of greed. Whereas critiques of capitalism deal with more inherent structural problems, and not to mention that it's also important to remember that in this system, the worker is also a consumer. So, but anyway, so Lasch is absolutely a critic of capitalism throughout all of his works. But you mentioned something I'd like to focus on, particularly on the mass media. I do think a little bit of historical context is especially important here. And again, I keep going back to the 1970s, but that's because it's important. That's why, he's writing at this time. The 1970s in the US, at least, I'm not sure how this relates to the UK, but in the US, the 1970s is when all the major news networks began to merge and become corporatized. So at the same time, we also see the rise of cable television here as well. So one of the problems with that is that to keep up with competing television programming, so you have more and more television programming, news networks began leaning more towards sensational news stories and taking on corporate sponsors. So what you see is this amalgam of Hollywood, so the film industry, the music industry, fashion industry, advertising, basically any aspect of big business, and electoral politics. All of these things became intimately connected with news media. So this is going back to Adorno and Horkheimer. This is the phenomenon that they meant by the culture industry. The culture industry is not some kind of like obscure amorphous blob. It is these things. And kind of funny that when Adorno and Horkheimer were talking about the culture industry, starting in the 1970s is really when this came into full force. This is after Adorno has already died at this point. So what they predicted, it's gotten even way, way worse than what they even foresaw. And this has become even more worse with the arrival of the internet and social media. And, it's important to remember that, most of the world's news media is just owned by just a handful of corporate giants. So what this means is that not only is news now indistinguishable from entertainment and advertising, but politics as well has become indistinguishable from entertainment or advertising. I'm sure this is not dissimilar in the UK, but in the US, we joke around about, oh gosh, it's election season again. It's almost like we talk about sports because it's, politics, mainstream politics have become pretty much just another form of either advertisement or entertainment. So this marks a point where we shift from being a culture of the written word to being an image culture, a culture of images. This started with TV, but this really blew up once the internet, the technology of the internet happened. And just to kind of talk on that point, the average American today is exposed to literally thousands of advertisements a day. So much of the information we get through the world is conveyed through images, and a large portion of those images are also advertisements. So when people participate in politics now, regardless of where you're at politically, it's usually in the form of performance. It's performative. And it's visually letting people know where you stand, but it's usually not making any kind of substantive change. The example that I can give is if you look at the Women's March in the US here in 2017, as this is often cited as one of the largest protests in US history. But despite such a large turnout, very little actual substantive political changes came from it. There were no clear goals or objectives. It mostly served as a kind of medium for people to demonstrate that they were on, to say what Derick said earlier, on the right side of history. This is this phrase that was frequently tossed around at the time. I'm going to steal a joke that a friend of mine made, where he said, if you attend a protest and there are no cameras, were you ever really there? But there's some truth to that snark of his, which is that most radical politics today have sadly become merely like street theater. And Lasch says that this turns electoral politics essentially into sporting events. And the unfortunate thing there is that it makes radical politics radical politics more difficult in this age of images and performance. So in this regard, Lasch's thought really, I would argue that Lasch's thought aligns more closely with Baudrillard. And he's actually talking about some of this stuff before Baudrillard is. So it's kind of interesting. I'm curious if Baudrillard engaged with Lasch. That's not something I've looked into. But Baudrillard is one of the key figures who really accurately analyzed the way news media has become unreliable in this age of images, because images are so easily manipulated. And of course, Baudrillard talks about this in his well-known collection of essays on the Gulf War. The Gulf War did not happen. And what he's saying is that we don't, he's not obviously saying that the Gulf War didn't actually happen, but what he's saying is that it's hard to understand what actually happened because that whole war was conveyed through so much news media imagery that it became, the truth of the matter became very unreliable. So Lasch, in this regard, I think Baudrillard is kind of who he's closely aligned with when he talks about the mass media.
Yeah, I would pick up on that a little bit as well. One of the things that Lasch is really concerned about is the way in which self-presentation cuts oneself off from history. What makes him different from the people that we're discussing, and even somewhat Baudrillard, although I think Baudrillard, I would agree with Shalon, Baudrillard's the closest person to him. And if people want the two books that make that the most obvious by Baudrillard, it's going to be read Culture of Narcissism and then read the Shadow of Silent Majorities and The Divine Left. And they feel like they're in dialogue with each other, just one's about French politics and one's about American popular culture. However, while Lasch takes a lot explicitly from the Frankfurt School, I mean, he cites them over and over again, and he explicitly is in engagement with Foucault. He's one of the first American authors, I find, citing Foucault in English in the 60s, before the Post-Structuralism Conference really brings Foucault to America. But he's pretty different in Foucault because he does not believe in things like epistemes or hard separations between time periods. He thinks that everything has informed everything else, going back to the instantiation of a national culture and into capitalism. So that is actually pretty different than Foucault's epistemes and genealogies. As far as Adorno, his critique of Adorno, who he's somewhat sympathetic to, is that Adorno gives up on actually dealing with the culture of the working class. And if you read, and this is like abundantly clear, if you read something like the Towards the New Manifesto, which is the notes published when Adorno and Horkheimer were trying to write a manifesto, you can see that they've given up on the working class largely because they think the culture of capitalism has inculcated them too. This is also a key point in Dialectic of the Enlightenment. Lasch doesn't join them in that. All right. Lasch actually is way more dependent on people like E.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams and the British Marxist humanist school. And he actually says some good things about Gramsci too, about that there are, even in a culture produced by capitalists for the working class, you will see elements of working class culture, solidarity and stuff in that culture that have not been erased by capitalism. And one of his critiques is, unfortunately, it seems like a lot of that gets manifested more on the conservative side of the cultural ledger in terms of like community maintenance and this, that, and the other. But it can't go anywhere because it is not political, properly speaking. And where I think Shalon's point about Baudrillard really is, and where this therapeutic state really is eventually nothing becomes political under this thing. Even politics is not political. Politics is an expression of a personal identity. And you see this in the fact, I think now, there's very little concern for local politics in the United States. People do not think about politics as expressions of local problems, but as general national trends of which the local stuff is just a response. And so they often cannot build political basis on which to act because they're focusing at the level of the nation, at the abstract, at the most furthest distance from themselves first. All right. This is a projection. This is a projection of self onto something else. All right. And the reason why the self is being projected is because the self feels small. There's no community for which that self is built. He actually talks about this in his reading in the 80s and 90s, where he's in dialogue with Michael Sandel, the kind of communitarian thinker, that both liberation and intolerance are directly related because they're just become expressions of self, and you expect other people to reflect yourself back to you. That is what politics becomes. Now, it is not insignificant that the sorting of American political parties, which are both bourgeois parties from a Marxist perspective, right, into kinds of ideational groupings of cultural expression happens in the 1970s. All right. There are liberals and conservatives of both sides of politics and both parties in the US. The ideological sorting happens concurrently with this sort of what Lasch sees as a narcissization. And such, the ideologies don't even really have content. They are systemic feelings, sentiments that reflect morality. Now, what is interesting, if you read Lasch's later work in True and Only Heaven, he traces this all the way back to Adam Smith, all right, which is something that we can talk about a little bit later. But that's different from almost any thinker we have, except for maybe, I said, like the Frankfurt School's dialectic of enlightenment is probably the closest thing to this in what you listed. But again, unlike the Frankfurt School, he's not willing to say that the working class, or what he would later call the lower middle working class, is totally removed from their historical incidents and subsumed in this totality of progressive culture.
I thought it's actually quite interesting to note that, relating it back to the concept of narcissism, one of the things that seems key to his concept of narcissism is there's an emptiness, there's a lack of self within it. It's almost like the self disappears rather than, or it's just a performance of the self rather than being a core. And I think that sort of plays to that. There's a question from the audience, which I was going to quickly read. So it says, hi, a bit of a naive question, perhaps somehow crass, because it's to do with a possible extension of Lasch's narcissist concept to the 21st century. So feel welcome to simply say the question is bullshit. Circa 10 years ago, people became more vocal about digital feedback chambers, in a sense, some kind of narcissist paradise. Homo narcissus as systemic condition.
Yeah, so I don't think that that's a bullshit question. I think it's a great question. One of the things that I think, when it comes to, I know I might end up sounding like a Luddite, and me and Derick have talked about this before, how, a decade ago, when we were trying to point out some of the problems with the internet and social media, people would accuse us of, oh, you're just being like a grandpa, you're just being a Luddite. And it's like, no, but there are some problems. And now I think that tide has sort of turned on that, and people are like, okay, yeah, there are some major problems with this technology, but it's not just the technology, but it's the fact that the technology is owned and operated by corporations. So echo chambers is a big problem, and I hate to say it, but I think it is one of the problems that we have on the left of getting ideas across. Getting these ideas across, they become very insular, and they don't tend to translate into actual substantive politics. They kind of become recirculated amongst ourselves. And I'll speak personally. A few years ago, I deleted all my social media. I have not regretted that decision. But when I have friends who tell me about certain debates and things that are happening online, sometimes they seem so petty, standing from now being an outsider to it. And I think that that's a problem because, when you're in it, some of these things seem huge. Some of these debates and nitpicking kinds of things seem bigger than they are, because you're speaking in circles, you're speaking within social circles that are just sort of regurgitating these ideas. And there's also, of course, the problem with how the technology actually functions. Algorithms are particularly set up, and I'm sure Derick will talk about this, but algorithms are particularly set up to increase engagement. And one of the ways it does that is by seeing the kinds of things that you engage with, showing you things that might get you agitated, all sorts of ways that we, in part, kind of do it to ourselves by engaging, but it feeds on that. So it's this feedback loop. There's also a psychological aspect there too, where, there's been lots of studies now at this point that look at how social media engagement, temporarily raises our dopamine levels. So, we're all, in this current pandemic and age of late capitalism, we're all, experiencing depression and anxiety and all kinds of, really mental illness on a mass scale. So social media plays into that by, getting you involved, and you get this momentary dopamine hit, and where it feels sort of good to engage, but that quickly goes away, and you sort of need more. It has a very addictive quality. So I'll let Derick say more on this, but I think that that's a great question, and a problem that we really need to, I don't know the answer, but something that we on the left definitely have to deal with if we really truly care about a revolutionary kind of politics.
Ooh, yeah, I think the one thing I'm going to say about this, though, and this is where I differ from the current liberal critiques of like, oh, Facebook ruined everything for us, is everything in social media was already peddled to us in television and instant gratification schemes from the 1950s forward. What makes social media so unique, it is both ubiquitous and personal. See the phone, you can get in at any time. And it becomes an extension of projection of ourselves as we want to be seen. All right. But it does so in clips and bits and bops in ways that even its physical technology alters the shape and development of your brain. And again, this starts actually with television. Blue light from screens diminishes executive function. This has been known since the 1980s. Like, yes, we're finally doing something about it now because of all the screens in our lives, but we have known this as a physical result of neuroplasticity. Actually, the own plastic nature of our minds is why this happens. And it's actually probably worse amongst the old because they have not been adapted to this environment, even though they've had screens most of their lives as well. You combine that with the echo chamber effect, and it leads to political blindsides. So for example, every democratic socialist I knew in 2019, be they in Britain or America, thought that they were on the verge of taking over society, because that's who they spoke to. And they spoke to it not just in their own country, but everywhere. But they don't understand the law of large numbers or who's on these platforms, particularly a platform like Twitter. Twitter is, for example, the id of basically media makers. I use it, and there are structural reasons why it's the id of media makers, because its algorithm doesn't punish organically shared content by the creator. Facebook does, because Facebook wants you to pay for them to share that content for you. I ran a from 2012 to 2001, I ran a literary journal. We depended primarily on Facebook engagement. That precipitously dropped the moment they monetize their algorithm, because it discourages that kind of content. It also ended blogging. Now, blogging has its own problems. Now we have microblogging, right? And again, because of other things in the economy, it has also changed the nature of news. You know what most reporters do now? They literally report on tweets, which means they're taking a limited character dialogue, mostly among themselves. Of the social media platforms that are widely used, Twitter is the smallest. All right. And yet, particularly after 2014, this fundamentally changed the way politics was done. And now you have political figures everywhere tweeting all the time, and people identifying with that and developing parasocial relationships with that too. Now, what Lasch couldn't know, because he wasn't actually reading a lot of the actual clinical literature on this, but that we know now that this actually has biophysical effects on you. All right. And when I started pointing this out in 2009, and I wasn't actually even talking about the internet, I was talking about television. I got called a boomer immediately. Because I was talking about how there's increasing processing speed in kids' thought, but you had executive function decline, a decline in empathy, an increase in anxiety, and actually eventually a decrease in literacy. All right. Now the literacy decrease took a while. At first, the internet actually increased literacy because it was a more text-based culture in the 90s and aughts than television. But by the time that you get to TikTok and YouTube dominance, that's over. And so as a teacher, I teach high school, and I've taught middle school, I've taught graduate students, etc. As a teacher, I can document to you that the average non-irritable time span of a student has declined from 30 minutes in the 1980s to about 10 minutes now. All right. But then you add to that the echo chamber effect, and that leads to the creation of things like safe spaces and this, that, and the other. Well, the thing about that is you literally don't know who's in charge. So to talk about you wanted to talk about the guide board and the spectacular element. All right. Well, for example, the right in America probably has more cultural control and control of local politics than it did during the Trump administration under Democratic rule at the national level. But you know what? Since it's not on the news all the time, people don't know it until they find out the hard way through actual local events, which do make national news, or when they realize that, say, the judiciary has totally been taken over by one faction in a way that people didn't even realize. Now, tie this back into Lasch. Lasch foresaw this. He actually foresaw the dependence on bureaucratic and non-democratic institutions as a means to do progress, actually making that, quote, progress really, really vulnerable. And that also, because of our expectations that politics reflects ourselves and our values, and that our values are emergent, sui generis from our true being or whatever, that we could kind of make anything sound like us. I used to talk about this as the God thinks like you problem, and this is not from Lasch, this is from me. That I noticed that evangelical Christians and Catholic Christians always made God have the values that they did. Well, what you start seeing is that happens with everything. Like the working class thinks like you, the arc of history thinks like you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because what keeps us engaged is to be irritated and activated, but also believe that the world reflects our values, and that even people who we think reflect our values share our epistemic and personal assumptions, which I almost guarantee you is not true. This technology, though, is because of consumer trends. This is all driven by advertising. Nothing in it is unique to the internet, which is why answers that just, let's just shut off the internet or logging off Facebook, it'll make that less so. It will disconnect you from a discourse community that removes you from the immediate community. But the larger trends that generated that internet and that particular way the internet manifested, all right, because the internet wasn't always like this. That isn't going to go away by shutting off your Facebook account. Now, it will probably help you to shut off your Facebook account, or God's sake, get off Twitter. And I say this as a person who's on Twitter all the time because I promote my own stuff. But this becomes a problem because I get pulled into, and I see it in myself, I get pulled into discourse patterns that are utterly removed from most people's way of life. Now, since I'm a teacher, I work in an office, I talk to people who don't share my political and cultural assumptions all the time. I am quickly reminded that no one even knows about most of these discourses even going on. And that is a major problem for the left, that the left actually imposes on itself. Because the left relies on the same capitalist technologies everyone else does. So yeah, narcissistic or narcissus. Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also thinking that just reading the first few chapters of the first 4 chapters or so of Culture of Narcissism, I constantly had to remind myself that it wasn't just written recently. There is something about it that you've got to kind of go, actually, it isn't just about like the internet. Yeah, so one of the things that makes Lasch's critique of the spectacle interesting is that it is an account of the spectacle. The spectacle is able to be participatory and still repressive. So for Lasch, it is possible to preserve hierarchical forms of organization in the guise of participation. And to my mind, this is useful in helping us think about contemporary issues around participation, whether we're talking about sort of human resources management or online platforms. How can Lasch help us think about problems and limits of participation?
I'm going to start with Adam Curtis, a person who I've actually criticized a lot, but Curtis was actually writing this. The person, if you're free to play a game, if you're liberated to play a game, but you didn't set the rules of that game up, you are participating under the guise of the people who actually set up the game. All right. Curtis makes this point in his documentary, the machines, blah, 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 the machines of loving grace. I forget the entire title. It's taken from a Richard Brodigan book. What is interesting about this, for example, is take the election of Barack Obama. All right. We were told that that Barack Obama would represent a massive change in the end of white supremacy and the participation of people of color in a political movement. But that was by extension. During the period of Barack Obama's presidency, and every major vector for Black people, and I'm not going to talk about people of color in general, I'm going to talk about specific groups right now, got worse in every way. They were disproportionately hit by the slow recovery. However, what the Democrats learned from that, and what they started arguing immediately, was that they would win the political debate because they looked like the future majority of the population. Now, okay, there's a bunch of faulty assumptions in that. One is demographics is not destiny, although they're arguing that it is, and then they're surprised when something like the Great Replacement Theory happens. Okay. Two, it consolidated white identity. Prior, if people remember, prior to 2000 and as the default, that we just defaulted to whiteness. All right. But it didn't have a positive identity. After 2016, we're always talking about white identity as a positive project, as opposed to, say, BIPOC identity or whatever. Now, how does this actually undergo levels of hierarchy? Well, one of the things that I've been pointing out to people, for example, is that the increase of, say, minority representation in the university has actually coincided with the increasingly during this time period, people actually come from more privileged backgrounds than they did priorly on aggregate, despite the quote increase of marginalized people. Then you actually look at who the marginalized people are, and this is what I call the rational core of the ADOS movement. If for those of you who don't know American politics, particularly Black American politics right now, there's been a movement starting in about 2014 that really came to prominence under the Trump years called ADOS, African Descendants of Slave Only. So it is a argument that immigrants who were not descendants of slaves are not entitled to reparations or other kinds of benefits accrued to people of color. A lot of people consider this movement reactionary. I kind of do too, but they have a legitimate complaint that actually was even talked about, and believe it or not, Christopher Lasch writes about it in the 1960s, which was the overrepresentation of immigrants of color who came from privileged backgrounds in their country of origin, representing the movement. So the actual people who've been marginalized and excluded do not actually benefit from their nominal symbolic inclusion into the order. And in fact, in many ways, things are worse for them than they were priorly, despite being symbolically included and having a slice of the elite. Because, and this is something Adolf Reed actually makes a big deal about, I think correctly, what you're seeing is these race discourses, these gender discourses pretend that race and gender don't really exist as division lines within marginalized groups. That since they seem as marginalized groups, as legally and systemically oppressed groups, or socially oppressed groups, that it creates a collective imaginary unity that is not there. But the rules of participation of the game haven't changed at all right? You still need wealth. And in fact, if you're a person of color, you need more wealth to engage in the system. And where do a lot of these people come from? From outside of the nation in the first place. Now, I see this as a problem with nationalism, and that there are parts of Lasch that I would criticize as not dealing with this on an international enough basis in his late work, but he does realize this problem, all right? So what does this have to do with the spectacle? Well, if we assume that symbolic politics actually represents the material lives of a lot of people, then symbolically including people like Barack Obama. Now, one of the things that again, racists used to even say this and point out that like Barack Obama's white family is literally descended from the same family as the Bushes. They're part of the Brahmin aristocracy of New England, capitalists who first came over and established the country. All right. So even his place there is both a change, a real and important change, but also an extension of the prior hierarchy. The reason why he gets to represent minority inclusion is because part of his background literally comes from the same prior privilege, not just capitalists, but a specific subset of founding capitalists that are genetically related to the founders of the country. All right. My friend Pascal Robert, who comes out of the Black nationalist tradition, actually talks about this. And part of why the response to Trump was so vociferous was because Trump was less of a part of that old original elite. And he's from a gauche nouveau riche elite, which he himself is also not self-generated. He comes from money, but not nearly as far back as, and you would even see this in liberal discourse, like the whole Trump discourse, if people remember that, which was both immigrant shaming and class elitist. And conservatives immediately picked up on that and used it. But the game doesn't change. And one of the things that Lasch points out in his light work is the ascendance of this new conservatism in the 1980s also didn't change the game at all. It continued the same old game. So whether you're talking about the progressive narcissist or the rugged individualist, they're both driving capitalism. And while one might be consumerist and the other one might be settlerist or whatever in our contemporary parlance, that their underlying motivations in relation to the idea of progress and capital is the same, and that the rules of the game have not changed at all, even though we are often presenting that we are changing them. So that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I have to add there. I do think that sort of related to this, if people are interested in this particular area of Lasch's thought, they would do good to read The Agony of the American Left, and also The World of Nations, two of his earlier books that I really enjoy, but don't seem to get much good attention. In The Agony of the American Left, he talks specifically about Black nationalism that Derick mentioned, and this is written in Agony of the American Left is written in like 1968, so even before like the countercultural events of 1969. So he definitely has finger on the pulse of some things that are going on. And one of the things he talks about is that Black nationalism, which many liberals and left liberals at the time viewed as very threatening. They were very suspicious about it. And, you know, because many of them came out of the more traditional liberal civil rights movement. Lasch points out, and he's right about this, and this was, you know, you can even verify his thought when you look into what went on in the 70s. But Lasch talks about how Black nationalism came as a response to the failures of the civil rights era, that, you know, put all of its focus on electoralism, all of its focus on legislation, rather than the actual economic and material concerns that people faced in the Black communities, things like unemployment and poor housing, and police violence. You know, these were real material concerns that they were experiencing, that the civil rights movement, for all the good that came from the civil rights movement, of course, those things were good things, but all their focus was mainly on electoral politics and creating legislation to protect rights. Well, even after the Civil Rights Act was passed in the 60s, we still see things like the Watts riots and all sorts of problems happening in the Black communities, because even though those things were now codified in law, they didn't actually do anything to address the real on the ground concerns. So this is similar to our contemporary moment, where these sorts of problems faced by specific communities are handled in a very liberal, performative kind of way that doesn't actually deal with some of the actual material problems. And Derick's mention of the Obama presidency and the lead up to the Obama presidency and the legacy of the Obama presidency, I'd add. You know, you see this shift amongst liberal culture in America, where there is a focus on, you know, saying the right words and having the right identifiers and the right labels when it comes to race and gender issues, but not very much that actually deals with the real problems, which often are problems of capitalism. And of course, liberals don't want to deal with the problems of capitalism because they are in bed with capitalism. And you know, just to clarify, you know, in the United States, whereas you know, liberals in the United States are much closer to the right than they are in the rest of like Europe. So you know, but they don't like to think of themselves that way. So you know, we see this type of politics now where that's dominated by mainstream liberals, mainstream conservatives, but they're both capitalists, they're both imperialist, and so much of their differences that they see amongst themselves are incredibly superficial. You know, and here's one of the funny things about Trump is that much of the things that liberals hated about Trump were the fact that he was rude and he said inappropriate things. But when it comes down to the actual politics involved, if you look at President Biden, Biden hasn't done much different than Trump has done, politically speaking and materially speaking. So
They're still kids in cages.
Yeah, and you know, Obama deported more immigrants than Trump did. So you know, at least at first, I'm not sure how those numbers ended up, but you know, so there's this disconnect between, again, I might be being American centric here. I'm not sure how this relates to the UK or elsewhere throughout Europe, but there is this problem here, at least, where what mainstream politics tends to care about the most are superficial things, are you know, if someone is nice, basically if someone is nice or not, not whether or not we should address the problems of capitalism. So I mean, I'm not sure if that really deals with your question much, but if you want to look at where Lasch is sort of dealing with some of these problems early on, he definitely talks about it in Culture of Narcissism, but you should check out Agony of the American Left, because some of these things are now bigger problems today, and he kind of touched on them early on.
Yeah, very early on. I would to make this relevant to our UK participants and event. I see this in current labor post Corbyn. Now I have my critiques of Corbynism, but I'm not going to go into them here. They're not relevant to Lasch. But one of the things that I saw recently was an ad by Starmer's Labor that actually tried to bring not just Black Lives Matter, which that could very easily be relevant to Britain, but the American form of Black Lives Matter to an ad for changes in British legislation, as if your racial problems have the same history as our racial problems. That only makes sense from a media-centric standpoint, and one that doesn't address much of the central problems at all, and probably doesn't have a lot of purchase even with people of color in the United Kingdom itself, because they would not necessarily be participating in the internet discourse of which they are adopting and appropriating from the United States, right? It seems very much the case that this is going on in the UK, and in a way that explicitly picks up and even maybe accelerates the problems of something like BLM. We'll talk about Black Lives Matter for a minute, because this is where the most recent incarnation of this is. Black Lives Matter, BLM, emerged during the Obama administration, people forget this, as a protest against police brutality in the excerpts of the industrial heartland of America. There's a reason why they happen in the industrialized Rust Belt, the area most affected by poverty in the U.S. It's urban. The two most affected areas are the Rust Belt and the South. All right. The protest movements move as follows. They start there and they end in Portland, Seattle, New York, and the Bay Area. Now, I don't need to explain to you that there's plenty of poverty in all those areas. In fact, there's a lot of homelessness in those areas, a ton of them out. So when I say this, I want that to be taken in advisement, but that the overall economy in those areas, those are some of the richest places in the world. All right. You can compare one with like Luxembourg and parts of Dubai as far as their overall wealth and the concentration of wealth in those areas. So what you have is an organic protest, riots, and a movement to do something in areas that are poorest that get quickly moved to areas that are the richest. Now, I think that movement's still organic, because a lot of those people who begin the protest are also disenfranchised by capital. They just happen to be in the richest and whitest areas of the country. Okay, fine. But then what happens? Well, BLM's declared over, and the police may be defunded in a few areas, but they're not abolished. Almost, of course not, right? That's the movement from defunding, from abolishment to defunding doesn't fundamentally change the political organization of the United States. It just makes it about a funding issue. And then immediately, when there's an uptick in crime in urban areas, which probably has nothing to do pro or con with BLM, to be honest, because not like police were really solving murders in the United States in the first place. What immediately happens? Well, we not just return the money, we actually double down on it. All right. The fundamental structure remains unchanged, but what did change? Well, now we are going to cast more diverse pictures of things. So we have Bridgerton. You know, let's do Regency and colonialism, but now we're going to diversify it, right, and make it look woke. Now, I don't like talking about woke because I think there's a whole tradition there that's lost. But there's actually one of the arguments Shalon and I have had it's about woke. But there is a sense in which we actually just think by diversifying some of the worst elements of our history. Hamilton is another example of this. And, you know, if you actually know the history of Alexander Hamilton, the fact that anyone would like see him as a progressive figure, even under liberal standards, is questionable unless you just think the central state is what progress is. All right. This has affected liberal thinking, though, to the point where when people talked about abolish ICE, there were liberals who literally thought that we shouldn't ever be talking about abolishing regulatory administrations. We'd be talking about making them progressive and humane, because any regulatory administrative is actually better than what the anarchy of the market or the anarchy of civil society. This is what Lasch is talking about, though. This is just an administrative apparatus to oversee progress. It isn't actually any fundamental change of power, nor does it fundamentally change the economic relationship with the United States. So nothing is actually addressed that caused the George Floyd uprisings is actually addressed by the ultimate answer that we got from them, which wasn't even legislation, right? We didn't even get that. It wasn't even judicial rulings like it was in the civil rights movement. It was literally a change in cultural marketing and the recognition of Juneteenth as a holiday. That's what we got nationally.
Yeah, and I'll just add something with Black Lives Matter, which, you know, one of the things, so like Derick said, here in the States, the Black Lives Matter movement started as a response to excessive police violence, especially towards African Americans. And, you know, but to be clear, police are, of course, violent towards everyone, especially the poor. But this organic movement that started to address police racism and violence was very quickly adopted by corporations. Apple and Amazon and Uber and all the major corporations started adopting Black Lives Matter statements, and they started using it as a slogan to advertise their products. So here we have another example of the ways that capitalism has taken what was at least started as a radical movement, as radical protest, and adopted it to essentially increase profits. You know, one of the things I've written about is how Uber, you know, was one of these companies who adopted Black Lives Matter as a slogan at the time, and they spent, I think it was like $500,000 or something that they pledged to donate to you know, Black causes or Black businesses. Even that was another thing that happened too, is that you see a lot of companies saying, oh, well, we'll just support Black business rather than actually deal with the problem at hand, which was police violence. So one of these big companies, I believe is Uber, but I'll have to double check, but they were like, oh, we're going to spend $500,000 and, you know, to support Black causes, Black business. At the same time they were doing this, they were spending millions of dollars in a large anti-union campaign, in a large union busting campaign. Now, the majority of the people who worked for them, who would be affected by them unionizing, or, you know, by the company preventing them unionizing, I should say, were people of color. So it really goes to show that these companies and, you know, this mainstream advertising doesn't actually care about the problems that are being presented. All they care about is what mainstream culture is adopting, and so they take it and use it as a form of PR. So, you know, this is, I mean, Black Lives Matter is just one of a million instances of this, you know, where, you know, it was Pepsi who had like a really awful commercial for Black Lives Matter, where it showed, you know, one girl handing a nice Pepsi to the police officer, and everybody, you know, was holding hands and happy together. And it was just so, you know, mind-bogglingly offensive that they would, you know, suggest that the ways to solve problems with police racism and violence is through purchasing more of their stupid products. So There's endless examples of this, but I mean, I think this really speaks to how easily in contemporary society, these sorts of radical elements are taken up and adopted by corporations for capitalism.
Just to add to this too, in American terms, what this has led to is increasingly the largest minority demographic in America, which is Latin immigrants and descendants of Latin immigrants and Chicanos, so Latin people who've been here, since the borders moved. Increasingly abandoning identification with both the left and with the Democrats. But you've even heard about this movement amongst Black men because it feels like nothing is being addressed, and including, and actually a big thing among in the Black community is discussion on families and the emasculation of Black men is a big discourse pattern in the Black community itself. Now, if you don't think this can lead to resentment that easily moves rightward, I would point you at the Dave Chappelle controversies, which was the whole framing trans issues as essentially a white issue, which it isn't, by the way, but still, because it was, quote, elite cultural people who were opposing him. Now, the irony of this is every person in this both belong in that debate around Dave Chappelle, both belongs to a marginalized community in a real tangible sense, but also was elite. They had, the people complaining against Chappelle and Chappelle himself have, had hundreds of $1,000s and $1 million deals with Netflix, or were very high paid employees, right? And in fact, I got really frustrated with other leftists for even trying to intervene one way or the other on this, because it was a distraction from both things that affect Black people, Black men, and queer people and trans people who are not rich, right? This became a way to not deal with the underlying systemic issues, both legal in the terms of the United States, because most of these things have been handled solely in the courts, but also economic, all right? So there is a real sense that Lasch is absolutely right, that the spectacular and the personal nature of these politics precludes the ability to fix them, because you're not interested in doing anything that would actually fix the problem. And this even affects things on policy, because we have to increasingly deal with identitarian means testing in the United States for who gets things. And this really does have legal effects. So for example, government grants that are granted to minorities are prioritized by which minority group you belong to. With the most effective, and historically is the most effective, being Indigenous people, then Black people, then Latin people, then Asian people, etc. So while there's all this talk about like minority majority stuff in the United States, which will happen by 2050 supposedly, there's also this fundamental assumption that because of progress, and because progress marches on this way, and because of the cultural representation and the symbolic means, and that everyone's on the right side of history, that most of these problems will be fixed because the people who look like them will be in power. But that's not even how politics really works amongst minority groups in the United States. Material interests actually do matter. And so increasingly, the ability of Democrats to point to the fact that they're diversifying their leadership doesn't really have political hold amongst people, because people are correct that it's not really changing their lives at all.
Yeah, I was just thinking from a fairly sort of everyday level that pretty much everyone I know, family members and stuff who are kind of Tory blue their entire life, and friends of friends and family of friends who I bump into in the pub, their criticism of Johnson's always been that he's not like an elegant statesman. He's like this bumbling fool or whatever, and or just makes gaffes. It's never really about the actual kind of political content of his decision making, etc. They'd be quite happy with somebody who's kind of pursuing in a fairly rightist conservative way, as long as they kind of carried themselves in a particular way. And I think this is exactly what a lot of critique from, I guess, Midwestern kind of Republicans kind of was, you know, being centered towards Trump, and maybe even kind of Southern state too, but I feel there was probably a little bit more pride with the Southerners, with a lot of the general sort of Southern state Republican voter in the kind of Trumpian behavior. At least I guess that's the common idea of it, maybe a bit of a simplification, but yeah, I think there's definitely similarities there. We're seeing that right now, and I think this whole current leadership debate in the UK going on right now is based around who can qualify themselves as somebody to restore pride in the kind of British statesman who will, you know, once again sort of restore our sort of image on the global scale. So, which is terrible because as it's completely fucking reactionary, and you know, even there should be some kind of self-consciousness even in those camps, but unfortunately that's not how politics play out anymore. At least, I don't know, yeah, not exactly a groundbreaking take.
We have a similar debate between DeSantis and Trump, where DeSantis may actually have more reactionary policies and more authoritarian policies than Trump even does. But because he didn't participate in January 6th, and because he's part of the Republican establishment in the way Trump is not, that there are even conservative liberals who and conservative Democrats who would prefer him, and probably while it's unclear if he could win the Republican primary, it does seem like a lot of people would be okay with a DeSantis type if he was an inside guy, similar to a lot of the same complaints that were made about Trump about his gauchiness were actually made about George W. Bush, who was an insider, but just put on populist airs. So, you know, I mean, this has been going on for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very true. I didn't think about the Bush kind of thing as well, and I guess that was a lot of the complaints. There was more that there was this kind of general kind of incompetency in his kind of speech making and in his sort of, it was that kind of thing, right? Whereas with Trump, it wasn't. I wouldn't even necessarily call it incompetency, but you know, it was a very conscious kind of aesthetic that he'd created around his tweets and his, you know, straight talking, non-political, you know, guy you can kind of trust, and yet still have this kind of beating around the bush, which was inherent to every speech, constant beating around the bush. Like, not to make a pun there with George Bush or whatever, but George Bush was so much lighter than that, really. I mean, with what he was critiqued for, right? It was just you know, poor uses of speech, you know, was it fool me once, can't be fooled again, etc. These kind of weird gaffes.
So because of the concern it raises about the declining standards of education, the rise of divorce, the decline in marriage and the breakup of the family, the proliferation of non-monogamous relationships, so social permissiveness and critiques of the welfare state, the culture of narcissism has been an inspiration to many conservative writers, which is something that we were discussing earlier. And Lasch himself has been accused of being a kind of cultural conservative. If Lasch is not a cultural conservative, how does his critique differ from theirs?
I can talk about that. So there's a lot in that question. I'll try to kind of talk about it in pieces. Well, first, I do think, first of all, we should distinguish between Lasch from conservatives broadly, in the sense that Lasch is focusing on the problems of private life becoming increasingly bureaucratized and dominated by capitalism, whereas conservatives usually tend to speak in these sorts of moral terms. But Lasch really wants us to look at the history of these institutions to see how we got here. And I'll start with education. So our educational system in the US, for instance, is largely the product of 19th century reformers and people who felt that the way to help the poor and the disadvantaged was to turn them into skilled workers. So it's in this way that, you know, you mentioned Foucault earlier. It's kind of like in the way that Foucault talked about how schools aren't much different than prisons. So, you know, these sorts of institutions have a 19th century, for the US, have a 19th century background. So our, in a short way of saying it, our educational system here is pretty much full with a lot of bourgeois baggage. Now this is especially the case after World War II, that here in the States, the university system became even more of a problem because it became closely aligned with the state. So research, especially scientific research, began to be funded by the state to universities to benefit the military and to benefit big business. So, this is the rise of, what we call the military industrial complex. And we see this even more so today, especially with, sort of the marriage between scientific research through the universities and the arrival of, big tech and all that. But Lasch was especially concerned from an educational perspective with a general decline in interest in history generally. So for Lasch, something that's really important for him is that history teaches us about our present moment. It teaches us how we got here, and it's important in understanding our present moment. And if we don't have a solid background in history and how we got here, then we're not going to fully understand the present moment. So this is key to pretty much all of Lasch's work. He was first and foremost a historian and really saw the value in public history and the public understanding why things are the way they are now because of the history behind them. So, but towards the end of the 20th century, when Lasch is writing Culture of Narcissism, and this is especially gets more so the case, colleges moved away from social histories and instead started moving towards particular specializations or the kinds of things that promoted a kind of bourgeois sense of career, specializations for the purposes of social advancement or achievement, not because you're interested in history or you have a particular calling, but there became a sort of cult of career achievement that you see, and this strongly aligns with how our educational history happened here. What many called it at the time, I'm not sure if this term is really used much anymore, but it was really sort of the rise of what we call the multiversity, where colleges weren't so much focused on actual education, but instead became a place for young adults to have social experiences. There's sports and parties and clubs and that kind of thing. This was a concern for Lasch, and he's one of the things that he predicted quite accurately, and he died before he even saw how this came about in full force, was he predicted how education was becoming less about education and more of a commodity. And this has especially become true in the 21st century. Again, I can't speak to UK colleges, but having read Mark Fisher, I think that there's a probably similar thing happening there that there is here, which, in the US, the privatization of universities and colleges is a big problem, and colleges now are sort of run like businesses. And and don't even get me started on starting in the 90s, the whole rise of what we call for-profit colleges, which is a horrible thing. So this is a widespread problem now. I can speak from personal experience here. I've been an adjunct instructor for the past 8 years or so, and so I teach college classes, the same college classes that a tenured professor would teach. However, I only make like pennies on the dollar per course, and I am not in the minority here. This is actually in the US, this is the majority. Over 70% of college courses are taught by adjuncts like myself, who are paid by the course like contractors. And they do it this way so that they don't have to give the benefits that are required by law for normal full-time employees. If you're categorized as a quote unquote contract employee, or what many are just starting to call gig labor now, then you don't have to have benefits or job securities or livable wages. They can just pay you by course. So that's why I end up teaching double the amount of classes that a typical tenured professor would teach, and I make a third of what they teach overall. So I have to cobble together 1 million classes just to make a livable wage, and even still, it's not that much. Meanwhile, you have this major shift towards administration, and where all the funding is going towards the, sports coaches, of course, make the most salaries here in the States, but also administrators and things like deans and chairs of branches of things that really don't, jobs that really don't need to exist, but they make, large 6-figure salaries. So, this is something that Lasch foresaw pretty accurately, and about the decline in education in the university system. And even after he died, it got even worse. But I do want to also talk about one of the other things you mentioned, which is marriage and divorce. So, in regards to that, there are some really important differences between Lasch and conservatives on these issues. Again, conservatives usually invoke things like traditional values or nuclear families, and these kinds of ideas when discussing 20th century issues surrounding the family, or a call for a return to something that, well, we all know that didn't really exist the way they think anyway. But Lasch does not think that we should go back, to some prior tradition. He's pretty explicit about that. But he does go back to the 19th century so that we can trace the history of the family as an institution in American society. So he's not suggesting that we return to some kind of prior format, but he wants to illustrate the way that the institution of the family became taken over by capitalism, by bureaucracy, by experts. So, like I mentioned earlier, parents are really not raising a child in modern society so much, but teachers and therapists and doctors and experts in these state institutions are really responsible for how a child is raised these days. So, some of the things that feminists misread about Lasch at the time, and unfortunately some of them still do, is that he was critiquing some aspects of the sexual revolution of the 60s, but what he saw were problems with that. It wasn't the fact that people were being more liberated sexually. It wasn't really that about the sex. What he saw was a problem was that sex became something that was separated from meaningful relationships. It was that separation between love and sex, where sex was just something that was used as a means of pleasure, and essentially using someone as a means to an end, instead of having to deal with the fact that relationships are complex and emotionally involved. He essentially said that this brought on a kind of way of using sex like a commodity. So, I don't think he would be surprised then, the way that our contemporary prevalence of dating apps and things like that, where people essentially are just shopping for sex. There's no deep emotional connection. I don't think he would be surprised at this, because it's essentially been a shift where sex is just another commodity. So again, these sorts of problems that he's dealing with are related to how capitalism developed, from the 19th century onward in the United States. And this also goes to his arguments about divorce. Now, I'm sure that Lasch would not suggest that, if a woman's in an abusive relationship, that she should stay in a marriage for marriage's sake or anything like that. I'm sure he would not suggest that. But he was concerned about the kind of frivolousness that people approached marriage in an age where divorce became something that was just really easy to get. So, this is especially true when children are involved. It's pretty well documented that one of the things that has a damaging effect on children is divorce. It greatly affects kids in a negative way. So Lasch would argue that this is not something to be taken lightly. That marriage is something that should be approached with a kind of seriousness and responsibility, not in a conservative way, not in the way that conservatives are like, sort of idealize the family in a kind of, Anglo-Protestant, kind of way, but in a sense that you are, you do have, when you are together and you are making children, you do have a responsibility to children. And so it's not the kind of thing that you should approach lightly. And, when I should point out that when no-fault divorces began here in the United States, which was in the 1970s, one of the biggest opponents to it was the National Organization of Women. The largest feminist organization. And the reason, one of the reasons for it was that they kind of viewed it as letting the person who's at fault off the hook too easily, because it absolved them of any sort of responsibility for the relationship. So, and there was a lot of feminists at the time as well who noted how no-fault divorce was a key factor in what would later be called the feminization of poverty, where women had no choice but to go into the workforce. So men were not held responsible for these families that they were leaving behind. And then, what would become the most dominant category in the growing poverty of the era were single mothers. So, this is again one of those examples where like a surface level reading of Lasch could be taken conservatively, but it really requires reading him a little bit more in depth because his concerns are not, he's not making a conservative argument. He's pointing out again, that there are concerns about the family that are stemming from larger economic problems happening in American society.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. I will state that this is where my co-author and I have the most vehement disagreement. I also don't think Lasch is making a conservative argument, though, but I want to go into this a little bit more. This is one of the things where I think removing the time period in which something is written actually really does hurt you. So from the standpoint of today, what do we see as the major trends in marriage in the United States? Poor people don't get married. Now, when Lasch is writing, that's the opposite is true. More poor people were getting married than the reverse. But what you see now is marriage itself has become a classed privilege. All right. There's not a lot of divorce anymore amongst the poor because they don't get married in the first place. And when they do get married, it tends to be younger and it does tend to end in divorce. So the stability of marriage becomes a class commodity. One of the things that I find ironic at this, and this is actually pointed out, unfortunately, by national conservatives and communitarians more than by leftists, is that what you see today is the promotion of sexual liberation amongst all classes, but that the class that is promoting it the most is actually the class that doesn't do it. That marriage is actually very much a thing that people in upper middle class America actually stay and maintain, even despite sexual infidelity, etc. Now, the concern about monogamy, this is something where I do think it's harder to say where I think there is actually a distinct change between late Lasch and early Lasch. Early Lasch, when he writes about family values and working family values, actually writes specifically in World of Nations an essay about the Mormons, and that he talks about Mormon polygamy and relative Mormon sexual permissiveness, but the focus on the family, even in that context, being actually a reflection of the development of working class culture. Now, he doesn't have a strictly Marxist definition of working class because he's talking about sharecroppers, all right? But he's arguing basically that there is a libertinism in there, but it is still somehow very family focused and becomes immediately, in the story, if you know the history of Mormons and Brigham Young, subsumed into a very patriarchal, very, very capitalist culture. But that isn't the story of its origins. All right. Now, later Lasch becomes concerned that the feminization of poverty, the abandonment of women could only be, he says this in, again, an essay called The Left Has No Future, which is a sequel to the essay that people ignore when they cite, this essay has become very popular amongst post-leftists in America these days. They ignore the first one, which is What is Wrong with the Right? One of the things that Lasch points out is that the concerns about patriarchy, the lack of ownership, and that the nuclear family was really a product of bourgeois marriage. It was only expanded to the working class in a real sense in the 1950s, and really only for half a generation. Lasch actually totally admits to all that. And he says, for example, the family wage system was never good enough to sustain a full family. And that then he talks about the self-subsistence of the 19th century and pre-industrial family life. This is the one spot where I think he might be being romantic. There's also a sense in which he does not deal with the fact that earlier anthropology doesn't necessarily reflect this pair bonding that he sees as organic. So Shalon and I often actually debate about this, and I don't necessarily absolve Lasch from these problems about norming things from the 19th century as somehow longer than they are. But he does put it in a conceptual history, and actually I would say he probably wouldn't say the same things about marriage now, but he would talk about marriage as a class phenomenon. All right. So instead of divorced single mothers, we just now have a bunch of always single mothers who are now tasked with not only the entirety of the rearing of children and of domestic labor, but also with being fully functional, independent economic operators in the traditional economy. And in some ways, Lasch would see this as the worst of both worlds. All the patriarchal norms still exist effectively, despite even a feminization of higher education, that actually isn't even really that real. And we can talk about that another day. But we have seen, for example, that women do better in schools, and that schools are increasingly organized around female norms. One of the interesting side effects of this is what we have not seen, for example, we've seen concurrently the hypersexualization of gender presentation, even amongst young people, and a revolt against that and increasing trans identification no longer attached to gender dysphoria as the condition. It is a rejection of these norms. That would actually seem to continue what Lasch would be talking about here, which is like that these relations have totally fallen down, but we haven't replaced them with anything. And that what this has actually led to is almost the idea that our expression of our inner selves has to be manifest in this very outwardly focused way, and particularly with the pressure among some teens. And this plays into a pretty pernicious cultural discourse in the United States, of which teens, and particularly trans teens, get sucked into, all right, and used as a football. And I think Lasch's wife often says, be careful about extrapolating what he would have thought about the future based off what he wrote at the time period. And on here, I don't know what we think he would make of the modern gender situation. I think he would think it would be very much not good, but I don't think he would be one of these cultural conservatives like Matt Welsh screaming about, you know, the trans agenda, which is really a code for the gay agenda, which is really a code for a bunch of agendas, right? That's not what he thinks is going on. In fact, he would say all that is a distraction from the social forces being destroyed by capitalism itself. Now, how would a Marxist feel about this? You know, a Marxist like me, deeply ambivalent, deeply ambivalent. Yeah, there's an interesting question. You mentioned the Lasch was informed by Marxist texts. Yes, he was. His ideas of the family was informed by Engels' ideas of the origin of the family, property, and state. We have no evidence for that. We don't have evidence that he actually read that. One of the things that I will talk about, though, that's related to that a little bit is family abolition for Engels, Babel, the First and Second International meant something very different than family abolition as it is commonly talked about now. So for family abolition in the 19th century, it meant free love, but free love did not mean just sleeping with whoever you wanted. It means being able to pair bond of your own choice. I'm
sorry to interject. I just wanted to add that, like, the free love conceptions that we got in the 1960s, you know, where it was essentially just promiscuity, like that's different than the free love conceptions that you see in like the 1920s radicals, who are essentially just saying I should be able to have sex with someone without marrying them. So, you know, that's one of those historical angles I just wanted to point out.
Yeah, and it's interesting how this has evolved. So one of the interesting things that I want to point out here, just as a cultural observation, I've been married twice, so obviously I have complicated views on divorce and whatnot. But one of the things that I have noticed is we have subsumed the expectation of emotional intimacy into a sexuality category. So we talk about demisexual. What's the definition of demisexual? The definition of demisexual is my sexuality is I must be emotionally attached to someone, you know, regardless of the gender. You could be hetero, homo, pansexual in this category. It doesn't actually tell you that. But the only thing it says is I require emotional intimacy as a prerequisite for sexual intimacy. It is weird that that's a sexuality, all right? Because it doesn't tell you anything about someone's sexual orientation. What it does is it flags an expectation that I'm not going to put out on a first date. That's strange, right? Lasch would say this is a development of this kind of signaling, all right? Of this reduction of a self to branding, of the expectation of meeting someone through these norms. And one of the ironies of this, if you actually have studied the sociology of OkCupid, I'll just leave it to that one. What you actually see in this is not just presentation, but even the norms of approach. So women approaching men, etc. The traditional standard is actually exacerbated by OKC, all right? So what we see now is men being encouraged to hyper pursue almost every woman on the app, or every person who takes the quote feminine role on the app, and if you want non-heteronormative terms, and women being rightfully discouraged from actively engaging between themselves, for opening themselves up to a flood of said gendered behavior. So more and more people contacting them all the time. This is actually an incredibly traditional notion of gender that these apps exacerbate. So one of the ironies in this is that the things that we are saying that we're ending, which is traditional gender norms, are actually exacerbated in the way we are expressing the ending of it. And Lasch would be laughing at us about that because he would have predicted it. Now, does that mean that Lasch thought that marriage would have been a substitute for that? He had his own, I will get biographical here a little bit. He was deeply, he had what we would consider a companionate relationship with his wife, but there were times in his life where that got more complicated. I'm not going to go into the specific reasons why, but that seemed to affect his views on family and what family was advised to do. And one of the things that he was worried about was increasingly sex and sexuality just being seen as an expression of your self-interest and desires, because it removed its social function and bonding. He also, however, did occasionally make arguments that were kind of conservative, in my opinion, in that he would always talk about, like, well, family is defined as men and women who have the potentiality to raise children in an organic way. And he would talk about, with the exception of some much oft talked about exceptions, right? Well, it turns out historically the exceptions are actually quite a lot. Monogamy is not actually a human norm, even in most societies, and comes quite late. That does not mean, however, that any of that looks like what we would consider as free love or polyamory or anything like that. And in fact, those societies that practice multiple partners are often quite restrictive. So the problem becomes, what is all this for? All right. And I think Lasch doesn't really have a way to deal with it. The one thing I will say that I am very sympathetic to Lasch on here is the overtaxing of, in the United States, particularly the schools, even, it's just the schools, with the raising of children, because the moment, and this should be clear after COVID, that that's not possible, you have near social breakdown, right? Indicating that while, and what this leads to in practice is now the schools are always a battle of culture war, because they're about the future raising of families and of the raising of values in children. And everyone is trying to enforce their values through the civic and bureaucratic control of an institution. All right. This is not good. This is not liberatory at all. This is not anything like, if you were, I always remind people, Marx actually was skeptical about state-run schools. Karl Marx, in the Critique of the Growth Program, actually is explicit about this. He says that basically a state should license teachers to make sure they know what they're talking about, and that's it. And that includes a socialist state, all right? That education is not the business of the state. Well, this has been, almost every Marxist I know has Deweyan assumptions about social engineering and education being partial to that, despite the fact that there's not even a whole lot of evidence that it works. All right. One of the things we can say about schools is, one of the things I actually have appreciated, now I'm a teacher, about schools, is after COVID, people just kind of admitted what they were for, which is to take care of kids so the mothers can get to work. That's what it was for. It was not for education. And unfortunately, because there's not a lot of evidence, it works for education, or that educational changes actually lead to significant broad-scale social outcomes as they increase. So the advantages you get from education are advantages in capitalism. As more people have education, those advantages diminish. It's pretty simple. And so none of that is things that you would see a conservative actually pick up on, because the last thing they would want to say is that capitalism is driving all this decay, or that that you should increase bureaucratic state to fill in for this. Now, There is some ways in which, for example, neoconservatives talk about the household as a way to get around the ever increasing need for social welfare, etc. Does mirror some of Lasch's critiques, but they mirror them. The reasons for them are different, and that needs to be acknowledged. You think that's fair, Shalon?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, because this question actually brings up like actually the debate between us about this.
I suppose he's calling it a haven in a heartless world, so that you have to take into account the heartless world rather than just the
right.
haven.
Yeah, and he also does argue in that book that we can't really go back to those norms either, even if we wanted to. Like, it's not possible under current conditions. Like, you can't reverse history, which is also different from conservatives who inherently want to either conserve or reverse history. That's what the name implies.
And so I know we've got about did you say you've got half an hour left?
I have about 27 minutes left, yeah.
27 minutes left. Is there a particular question that you'd want me to ask out of the ones that I've left?
Well, if you want, since it's kind of related to this, you have a question about the feminization of labor, which I can talk a little bit more about because it kind of relates to what we're already going on about.
Yeah, so I mean, I just chose 2 quotes which were from the book, but I can read them out. So I wanted to draw out 2 elements from Lasch's thought around gender. At one point, seeming to preempt theories of the feminization of labor, he says that the prostitute, not the salesman, best exemplifies the qualities indispensable to success in American society. And at another point, discussing feminism, he says that the feminist movement has always found it tempting to renounce its own insight and program and retreat into some kind of accommodation with existing order, often disguised as embattled militancy. So in the first quote, the first quote concerns the changing nature of labor, but with very gendered allusions. And then the second concerns the limits of existing feminism, but also the possibility of a truly radical approach to feminism. What are the problems and possibilities for using Lasch to think about gender and feminism?
So, I'll try to keep this aspect short since we're running low on time, but I think it is important to approach this because one of the main groups who attacked Lasch were feminists, and they often misunderstood his works, and Lasch frequently and explicitly fought back against these charges against him in all of his writings. And you can even see in Culture of Narcissism, like the reprinted version, he added a new preface that specifically addresses each and every feminist attack against him and essentially points out that they misunderstood what he meant. So, of course, Lasch, being somebody from the left, was concerned for, women's rights. And, he explicitly says so. So, but what Lasch points out, and this is an incredibly important for piece of his discussion on this topic, he wants to look at the history of American feminism starting in the 19th century to essentially illustrate how feminism had and still has some core internal contradictions. And this is really key to understanding Lasch's arguments about feminism today. So, a little bit of history there. At the turn of the century, feminism was dominated by the progressive movement. So, of course, there was, feminism within. There were all kinds of different left-leaning movements at the time, but feminism was mostly rooted in the progressive movement. Which was largely wealthy bourgeois women who really sought out reform as kind of a sense of personal therapy when you have too much leisure time. And really, one of the figures he talks about pretty extensively in his early works is Jane Addams. She kind of embodied this. She's a good example of, bourgeois feminist who really use social reform as almost in the sense of personal therapy. So exploring some of his early works, we'll kind of go into some more on that. But at this time, when feminism was developing at the turn of the century in the US, there were two main branches of thought. There was one camp who saw women as being biologically distinct from men. So it was this group, one camp saw women as being inherently like the civilizers, natural caregivers. So there was a distinct biological difference that they wanted to separate women from and essentially put them in a special sort of protected class. And of course, they were thinking about women who were abused and things like that. And they felt that society should protect women because they had special qualities as women. But then there was another camp who went against this biological aspect, and instead they were like, no, actually women should be considered equal as men, treated equally, both in the workforce and politics. And that means that there is no special treatment or protection for women for being women. So I don't need to elaborate, we don't have time, but clearly you can see there are issues here. There are some contradictory things happening here. If you buy into one camp, then you have to also go with the logical conclusions of what those sort of biological gender categories mean and vice versa. So by the 1970s, fast forward to the 1970s when Lasch is writing Culture Narcissism, there's an economic reality happening in the United States where women are essentially forced to enter the workforce, whether or not they wanted to be career women or not. So, this is because of the economic situation at the time, more and more women had to enter the job force. We see the rise of two income or households with two incomes instead of one, because one would no longer cut it by this time, by the time of stagflation and whatnot. So, some of the largest increases in the US that we see of women entering the workforce happened during the 1970s. And, I'm sure that's increased since then. But up until that point, the largest increase we had of women entering the workforce were the 1970s when he's writing. So now you also have at the same time, which kind of muddles this history, you have a lot of women's liberation movements sort of taking off. So, a lot of women's liberation movements didn't really take off as much in the 60s as we commonly remember. A lot of that happened in the 70s. I mean, Roe v. Wade, which was recently overturned here in the US, which protected abortion rights and privacy rights in that regard. That came about in 1973. So, feminists at this time were crediting more and more women entering the workforce as a result of women's liberation movements. But the reality is that this shift was largely economic in nature. So Lasch would argue that, women having to work, not having the choice to work, but having to actually go to work, that's not truly women's liberation. And that's the key there of, really understanding what Lasch is talking about. He's pointing to a larger socioeconomic malaise that was happening in the 1970s and essentially critiquing what we would now call, the kind of quote unquote girl boss feminism, where, a woman in a capitalist executive CEO kind of position is considered a feminist and empowered, even though they're now in a position of power that is responsible for exploiting women. So, so that's really the kind of critique he's making, if you want to think of it, is he's pointing out that more women having to work is not actually evidence of the liberalization or the liberation of women. What he's pointing out is that actually, these are economic concerns that are causing women to have to enter the workforce and be exploited equally as men, so by capitalism. So Derick, did you want to say more on that?
I think we have to really point out that the inflation crisis is largely what drove women's participation into the workforce, and that the Betty Friedan story was really about upper middle class women who could choose to work after being alienated. And there's a lot more to go on with this. I mean, I actually think there are some feminist histories that actually confirm this, that talk about the home in the 1950s, the nuclear family, as with all the democratization that also was dependent upon all these machines replacing servants of the bourgeois family, and those norms being temporarily normalized. One of the interesting things about the debates between Lasch and feminists, that there's again, I'm mentioning a crucial essay here from Cocoon 1987, which is a debate with Lillian Rubin, and it's in the essay Why the Left Has No Future. But what's funny is, despite how kind of mean both Rubin is to him and he is to Rubin, they agree on 80% of the situation. Rubin admits that the bourgeois family is temporary, and that basically companionate marriage is the answer. What Lasch says is companionate marriage is only possible if there's social restrictions to keep people being together, and that most of the expansions of the quote welfare state don't help that. They actually infantilize everybody. And Rubin actually agrees with it, but doesn't agree with the divorce mechanisms and whatnot. Where they differ, and this is interesting, and I actually think Rubin does land some points on Lasch. As Rubin points out, that the family that he's normalizing as organic actually does have specific historical roots. He doesn't disagree with that, but he actually thinks the cultural norms are actually, that would back that up, are more important than the roots. And that's actually, that he only does that in that essay, and True and Only Heaven, he actually takes a different stance, at least so far as I'm reading it right now. Now, all that is to say that Lasch also thought that there was a radical core to the historical feminist movement. He writes about it. And some of it was working class. But he actually points out that historically speaking, it's not the working class forms of feminism that win. It's either the forms of feminism that are useful by progressives, or even forms of feminism that are useful for conservatives. He talks about the Aunt May feminism that is why suffragettism is actually achieved in the US states in the conservative West before it is achieved elsewhere. All right. And that is because it is presented women as not only biologically different, but also as the civilizing form of life and a essentially conservative factor. This actually plays out in weird ways in both the European and the American socialist and feminist movements, where socialists have to go back and forth about how they feel about, say, even women's suffrage, which is kind of an interesting problem. And I'll just bring up one example of this. The debates between Clara Zetkin and Elizabeth Nesbit on whether or not socialists should support women's suffrage, because Nesbit was afraid that women would inherently just actually empower conservative men by expanding their vote, et cetera, and so forth. And Lasch writes about that too. And it has led to this weird, in America, what we're talking about is Gorgout feminism also gets called what gets labeled as white feminism. And it's interesting that it's per se is only white, as if the class issues are only issues of race. But What you see now is a lot of the critiques that Lasch was making have actually been picked up by feminists themselves to critique, quote, white feminism or bourgeois feminism or whatever, but they still don't really address that just expanding the categories doesn't fix the problem. And then if you really look at the way the current gender wars are playing out between conservatives, the contradictions in this early feminist movement matter there too. All right. Whether or not gender is essential or not becomes another vector of eternal argument, and one that can have conservative flavor depending on who's using it for what. And so we see this massive realignment of like second wave feminism with conservative elements, which we saw in the battle against porn in the 1980s, but also in the battle against trans inclusion now. I mean, we can always think about J.K. Rowling as a perfect example of this contradiction, though this contradiction has roots way before these issues were even common. So I think that's really what Lasch is picking up on. Do I always agree with his answer to them? No. But I do think we have to acknowledge he has a point here about the way feminism has been used and deployed culturally, because it is very true that in the 1970s, the women's liberation narrative about feminism completely erases how many women were forced into work because inflation devalued the male wage, and the family wage system became truly incapable of handling the situation.
Right. I think we should sort of aim to wrap up now, because I think that well, you're off in a second anyway. I don't know if there's any closing thoughts you want to add.
No, I don't really have any closing thoughts other than I'll just say that, I do think that, Lasch continues to be misread and taken up by conservatives, which is unfortunate because he viewed himself as someone from the left. And I think a lot of his stuff has relevance for now. I mean, there's a reason that Lasch came back into the fold again around 2016 with the Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump situation here in the United States, because regardless of the issues of that, electorally speaking, what it did point to was that large swaths of people on the left and right were looking for alternatives to mainstream politics, and Lasch really was able to pinpoint some of that early on, and sort of, I hate using the word predict, but in many ways he predicted this contemporary situation. So I think he has a lot of relevance for today. I'll also just add that one of the things that makes Lasch particularly relevant, in my opinion, is that he's not, he doesn't talk like an academic. I know before we started recording, we were talking about some of the ways that academics write, which can be, sort of obscure and sloppy, and doesn't really appeal to regular people. And Lasch was somebody who thought that history had important relevance for the public and constantly tried to convey these ideas and rewrite his ideas so that he could convey these ideas in general terms for regular people. So, I think that he's an interesting figure that has a lot to offer us for our current situation. I think there's a lot we can learn from him. So, again, I would recommend, if anyone wants to read him, not to read Revolt of the Elites. Not saying that there's not good parts in that, but it just has a history to it that, and a biographical history to it as well, that makes it one of his weaker books. But Culture of Narcissism, I still think holds up. And if you want to read a book that's not so heavy on the psychoanalytical terminology that Culture of Narcissism is, then you might want to read the book that comes right after, which is essentially making the same argument, but without so much of the psychoanalysis. So that's the Minimal Self. So that's where I would start with Lasch. But one last thing is that as you know, being people on the left, Agony of the American Left and World of Nations both have a lot to offer, I think, our contemporary moment as well. Lasch did point out the different ways that, in simple terms, that the left sold out in many different ways. So I would check those out if these are things that interest you, but I do think he's a figure that has relevance and importance that we can use for our contemporary moment.
Yeah, I would say, I would also say I would go for Lasch for problems. I wouldn't go for Lasch for solutions, because he doesn't pretend to have them. And when he does try to have them, he often seems to focus on the level of culture. I do think a lot of Marxists are particularly vulgar in their understanding of culture as it's all just superstructural euphemia, which I don't even think is a good reading of that metaphor, because social reproduction is part of the base of society, even in Marx. But I would say that go with him looking for the problems of where we're at and use him to think through what the solutions may be. You won't necessarily come to the same conclusions about the solutions. And I do think also, for all that he seems to predict things that we're about now, there are things that have fundamentally changed. Like, we don't have a divorce epidemic now. People just don't get married. You know, and if anything, we've seen there seems to be a limit to, we've hit a limit to this whole progressive way of thinking in a lot of ways. And this is breaking down all over the world, not just in the United States. But we haven't replaced it with anything. And we still talk in its habits, just like we talk in the habits of neoliberalism, etc. But we also have to remember, Lasch wasn't writing about neoliberalism. He was writing about Fordism and the transition to neoliberalism. And that's important to remember. I would also say, I think his critiques of education are particularly pertinent about the role that progressive education actually really had in capitalism. And there's a person who I would tell people to read in addition to Lasch that actually kind of picks Lasch up. And he's not a leftist. He's also not a right winger. He's a kind of populist pragmatist. He's Louis Manan, used to write for The Atlantic. And he wrote a book on the American university that really goes into this and picks up this stuff explicitly from Lasch. He actually saw what he was doing in the same tradition as what Lasch was doing about education. So if people want to check that out, it might be something to help you out. That's all I really have to say. And I want to thank everyone for listening to us for 2.5, 3 hours. So.
Yeah,
yes, thanks so much for having me. It was a great time. I also just want to say that anyone involved with the Exploding Appendix movie that you guys recently made, I really enjoyed it. So hopefully you guys can get that into festivals and put it on Letterboxd so I can log it.
Yeah, seriously.
Letterboxd, I actually don't know what Letterboxd is.
Oh, it's a symptom of the things we're complaining about, but it's a way to get your it's a way to show people what you read.
It's like Goodreads, but for movies. So for movie fanatics like myself.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for both of you coming on and talking for actually quite a long time about Christopher Lasch. But yeah, really interesting and really fascinating, and I can't wait to read the book when it comes out.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Have a great evening.
Yeah, you too. Good luck with all the other stuff you've got to do.
Yeah, I got to go hop on a stream with Doug Lane and talk about Hegel. So that's going to be fun. All right, take care.
Enjoy.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit our website at www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, YouTube, Eventbrite, or Twitter. Exploding Appendix, ideas in culture with guts.